Alaska holds more missing person cases per capita than any other state in America. In a land where darkness swallows the earth for months at a time, where the nearest neighbor could be hundreds of miles away, and where temperatures can kill you in minutes, some disappearances have explanations that are far worse than death. Tonight, I'm sharing 7 disturbing true stories from the last frontier that will make you question everything you think you know about isolation, survival, and what lurks in the endless Alaskan wilderness. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales passed down through generations. These are documented accounts from real people who experienced the unthinkable in America's most unforgiving landscape. From a research scientist who discovered she wasn't alone in her remote station after 3 months of supposed isolation, to a mining crew that found fresh equipment running in an abandoned mine that had been sealed for decades, each story will take you deeper into the psychological terror that only Alaska's brutal environment can create. Before we begin, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because you won't want to miss any of our spine-chilling content. Trust me, after hearing what happened to Dr. Elena Rodriguez during her solo assignment at Weather Station Delta 7, you'll understand why even seasoned Alaskans refuse to venture into certain parts of their own state. Her final radio transmission still gives investigators nightmares, and by the end of tonight's video, it will haunt yours too. Story number 1. The Ice Road Trucker. Marcus Chen had been driving the Dalton Highway for 12 years, hauling supplies to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay, but nothing had prepared him for the cargo manifest he received that frigid February morning. The paperwork was standard except for one detail that made his blood run cold. The pickup location was listed as Mile 47, a stretch of road where no facility existed, just endless tundra and a decades-old airplane wreckage that truckers used as a landmark. When Marcus arrived at the coordinates, he found a single shipping container sitting in the snow with no explanation, no personnel, and no footprints leading to or from it. His dispatcher confirmed the pickup over the radio, insisting the container contained medical supplies for the North Slope, but something about the situation felt fundamentally wrong. The container was ice cold to the touch, far colder than even the -30 air temperature, and when he secured it to his trailer, he noticed the metal was covered in a strange frost pattern that looked almost like handprints pressed against the surface from the inside. 3 hours into the drive, as darkness swallowed the highway and his headlights became the only source of light for miles in any direction, Marcus heard the first tap. It was subtle, rhythmic, coming from inside the trailer. Tap, 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 like someone knocking gently on metal. He convinced himself it was just the cargo shifting with the road vibrations, but the tapping grew more insistent, more deliberate, until it formed a clear pattern that sounded disturbingly like Morse code. When he pulled over to investigate, the tapping stopped immediately, and the silence of the Arctic night pressed against him like a living thing. Marcus walked around his trailer, checking the locks, the seals. Everything was secure, but when he placed his ear against the container wall, he could hear something that made his knees buckle, the sound of slow, deliberate breathing coming from inside a container that was supposed to contain only medical supplies. He called his dispatcher, demanding to know what he was really hauling, but the radio crackled with static, and when the signal cleared, a voice that wasn't his dispatcher whispered through the speaker, "Don't let us out, Marcus. Please don't let us out." The temperature gauge on his truck began climbing rapidly despite the Arctic cold, the engine overheating for no mechanical reason, and as steam poured from under the hood, Marcus realized he was stranded on the most isolated highway in North America with something in his trailer that was very much alive and desperately trying to get out. The tapping resumed, now coming from multiple points inside the container, dozens of hands drumming against the metal walls in perfect unison, creating a sound that echoed across the empty tundra like a death march. Marcus grabbed his emergency radio and tried every frequency, but each channel carried the same whispered message. "We're almost ready, Marcus. We've been waiting so long to stretch our legs." When he finally managed to reach a passing trucker on CB radio, The driver told him something that made his heart stop. There was no shipping company at mile 47, there never had been. And according to dispatch records, Marcus Chen had been declared missing in action 3 days ago after his truck was found abandoned on the Dalton Highway with no trace of the driver or his mysterious cargo. Story number 2. The Cabin Rental. Sarah and Mike Torres thought they had found the perfect honeymoon retreat when they booked the remote Airbnb cabin nestled 40 miles outside Denali National Park, accessible only by a winding dirt road that disappeared into dense spruce forests. The listing promised complete privacy, no neighbors for miles, and breathtaking views of the Alaska Range. But when they arrived at sunset on their first evening, Sarah noticed something unsettling about the cabin's interior. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the space that clearly didn't belong to any rental property. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table, still damp towels hanging in the bathroom, and a coffee mug with lipstick stains sitting beside the sink as if someone had just taken a sip and walked away. Mike dismissed her concerns, suggesting the cleaning crew had simply been careless. But that night, as they settled into bed, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the wooden floors above them. The cabin was only one story. Sarah grabbed Mike's arm as the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth in a rhythm that suggested someone was walking the exact length of their bedroom directly overhead in a space that shouldn't exist. When Mike went outside to investigate, he discovered something that made his blood freeze. Fresh tire tracks in the snow leading to the cabin but not leading away, and a second set of footprints on the front porch that were far too small to belong to either of them. The Airbnb host didn't answer their calls, and their cell phones showed no signal despite the listing promising full connectivity, leaving them completely isolated as strange sounds began emanating from the cabin's basement. The basement that, according to the floor plans, didn't exist. Sarah found the hidden entrance behind a bookshelf in the living room, a narrow staircase descending into darkness where the sound of muffled voices drifted upward like whispers from a grave. When they finally worked up the courage to investigate, they discovered a fully furnished living space complete with recent groceries, unmade beds, and family photographs showing people they had never seen before, but who were clearly still living in the space beneath their feet. The photographs were dated just 2 weeks prior, and in the background of each image Sarah could see the same furniture and decorations that filled the main cabin above. Mike found a guest registry hidden in a drawer that contained dozens of entries from previous visitors, all describing the same experience: hearing footsteps, finding personal belongings, discovering they weren't alone. But every single entry ended with the same chilling phrase written in different handwritings: "We decided to stay." As Sarah read through the entries, she realized the signatures matched the names on the photographs scattered throughout the basement, and when she looked closely at the most recent photo, she saw her own reflection in the window behind the smiling family, taken 3 days before they had even booked the cabin. The basement lights suddenly cut out, plunging them into absolute darkness, and in that suffocating blackness, they heard the voice of an elderly woman calling from somewhere in the depths below. "Sarah, Mike, dinner's ready. Come down and meet the family. We've been waiting for you to join us permanently." When they tried to run back upstairs, they found the hidden entrance had sealed itself, and carved into the wooden doorframe were dozens of names and dates, with the most recent entry reading, "Torres family, arrived February 14th, never left." Story number 3. The Hunting Guide's Last Trip. Jake Morrison had guided hunting expeditions through the Brooks Range for over 20 years, leading wealthy clients into some of Alaska's most remote wilderness areas. But the group of 4 businessmen from Texas who hired him for a 2-week caribou hunt would become his final expedition in ways he never imagined. The clients, Robert Kellerman, David Walsh, Marcus Thompson, and James Rivera, seemed normal enough during their initial meeting in Fairbanks, though Jake noticed an odd intensity in their eyes when they spoke about wanting to hunt something truly challenging, something that would test their skills against nature's most elusive prey. 3 days into the expedition, as they tracked a caribou herd across the windswept tundra near the Arctic Ocean, Jake discovered tracks in the snow that made his 20 years of wilderness experience suddenly feel worthless. The prints were massive, far larger than any known Arctic animal, with 5 distinct claw marks that extended nearly 4 inches beyond each toe pad. But what disturbed Jake most was that the tracks seemed to be following their party rather than simply crossing their path. When he mentioned the unusual tracks to his clients, Robert Kellerman smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and said they had come to Alaska specifically hoping to encounter something extraordinary, something that couldn't be found in any other hunting ground on Earth. That night, David Walsh didn't return to camp after going to relieve himself behind a cluster of boulders just 30 yards from their tents, and when Jake went to search for him at first light, he found Walsh's rifle abandoned in the snow alongside a pool of blood that had already frozen solid, but no body and no signs of a struggle. The remaining clients seemed strangely unconcerned by their companion's disappearance, insisting they continue the hunt while Jake grew increasingly convinced they were being stalked by something far more dangerous than any caribou. Marcus Thompson vanished the following evening while standing watch, his sleeping bag and personal belongings left undisturbed in his tent. But Jake discovered something that made his hands shake as he examined the campsite. Thompson's boots were still laced and sitting beside his sleeping bag, as if he had simply stepped out of them and walked barefoot into the Arctic wilderness. When Jake confronted the remaining 2 clients about the impossibility of their companion's disappearance, James Rivera pulled out a satellite phone and made a call, speaking in hushed tones to someone on the other end before hanging up and telling Jake that their extraction helicopter would arrive in 2 days, but they needed to complete their hunt first. The next morning, Jake woke to find Rivera's tent empty, and a trail of those massive, clawed footprints leading directly from the tent opening into the vast wilderness. But the prints were accompanied by a second set of human footprints that perfectly matched Rivera's boot size, as if he had willingly walked alongside whatever had taken the others. Left alone with Robert Kellerman, Jake demanded they abandon the expedition immediately. But Kellerman calmly explained that Jake had been hired for more than just his guiding skills. He had been selected specifically because of his reputation for leading clients into the most isolated areas where no one would hear the screams. As the sun set on their final night together, Jake realized the hunting expedition had been arranged not to track caribou, but to deliver him to something ancient and hungry that lived in the spaces between human understanding. And Robert Kellerman had never been a client at all, but rather a coordinator, ensuring that Jake Morrison would become the most challenging prey he had ever encountered in his 20 years of guiding hunters through Alaska's most unforgiving wilderness. Story number 4. The Research Station. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had volunteered for the 3-month solo assignment at Weather Station Delta 7 because she craved the isolation and silence that only Alaska's most remote outposts could provide. But after 6 weeks of monitoring atmospheric conditions 70 miles north of the Arctic Circle, she began to suspect that her carefully maintained logs were telling a story that defied every principle of meteorological science. The station's automated equipment had been recording impossible weather patterns, temperature spikes of 40 degrees in the span of minutes, barometric pressure readings that suggested massive storms where clear skies stretched endlessly, and wind measurements indicating hurricane-force gusts during periods of absolute stillness that Elena could observe through her windows. When she contacted her supervisor at the National Weather Service via satellite radio to report the equipment malfunctions, Dr. Patterson's voice crackled through the static with confusion, insisting that Elena had been at the station for only 3 days, not 6 weeks, and that her last check-in had been received just that morning. Elena stared at her meticulously kept calendar, where she had marked off 42 days with red X's, each entry accompanied by detailed notes about her daily observations, meals, and radio contacts that painted a clear picture of 6 weeks of isolation. The discrepancy gnawed at her sanity as she began finding evidence throughout the station that supported both timelines simultaneously. Her food supplies suggested she had been there for 6 weeks, nearly depleted according to her consumption schedule, But the duty roster posted by the previous researcher was dated only 4 days prior with a note welcoming Elena to her first week at Delta 7. During her next scheduled radio contact, Elena heard her own voice responding to Dr. Patterson's questions, providing weather updates and confirming her well-being. But she was sitting in complete silence with the radio microphone untouched in her hands as her doppelganger discussed observations that Elena had made weeks earlier. The temperature inside the station began fluctuating wildly despite the heating system functioning normally, and Elena discovered frost forming on the interior walls in patterns that resembled calendar pages, each ice crystal arrangement showing different dates that spiraled backward through time like a frozen timeline of her deteriorating grip on reality. When she attempted to leave the station to verify her sanity by checking the external equipment, Elena found the exit door sealed with ice despite the interior warmth, and through the small window she could see herself walking through the snow outside, conducting the same equipment checks she had performed dozens of times, but the Elena outside was wearing the clothes she had arrived in 6 weeks ago. The radio crackled to life without any incoming transmission, and Elena's own voice began reading weather reports in a monotonous loop, describing conditions from every day she had been at the station, but the reports were being broadcast in reverse chronological order, starting with tomorrow's observations and working backward through weeks of data that she had not yet recorded. As Elena listened to her future self describing weather patterns that had not yet occurred, she realized that Weather Station Delta 7 existed in a temporal anomaly where time moved in circles rather than straight lines, and every researcher who had ever been assigned to the station was still there, trapped in overlapping loops of isolation where the same 3 months played out eternally, with each iteration adding another layer of observers recording the same impossible data from slightly different temporal perspectives, creating a meteorological hell where Elena Rodriguez would continue monitoring weather that defied physics while slowly forgetting which version of herself was real. Story number 5. The Bush Pilot's Final Flight Captain. Tom Bradley had been flying passengers across Alaska's unforgiving wilderness for 15 years, navigating through mountain passes and landing on makeshift airstrips that existed only as coordinates on outdated maps. But the charter flight he accepted on March 15th would challenge everything he understood about aviation and reality itself. His passenger, an elderly woman named Margaret Sinclair, had booked the flight from Anchorage to a remote research facility near the Wrangell Mountains, paying in cash and providing coordinates that Tom's GPS couldn't locate in any database, though she assured him the landing strip had been operational for decades. 20 minutes into the flight, as they soared over the Chugach Range, Tom noticed his instruments beginning to behave erratically. The altimeter showed they were climbing when he could clearly see they were descending. The compass spun wildly between magnetic readings, and most disturbing of all, his fuel gauge remained fixed at 3/4 full despite running the engines for nearly an hour. When Tom glanced back to check on his passenger, Margaret Sinclair was no longer the elderly woman who had boarded his plane, but instead appeared to be a middle-aged version of herself, wearing clothes that seemed decades out of style and speaking about the research facility as if she had worked there recently, though the coordinates she had provided led to an area Tom knew had been uninhabited wilderness for generations. The radio crackled with air traffic control communications, but the voices were reporting aircraft movements and weather conditions for flights that had occurred years earlier, including detailed discussions about search and rescue operations for a missing Cessna piloted by Tom Bradley that had disappeared in March of 1987. As Tom tried to process this impossible information, he realized that his passenger was now a young woman in her 20s, excitedly discussing her new job at a research facility that she claimed was conducting groundbreaking experiments in temporal physics, and when he looked at his reflection in the cockpit window, he saw his own face but decades younger, wearing a uniform he remembered from his early flying days. The landscape below began shifting between seasons in rapid succession. Snow-covered peaks transformed into summer green, then autumn gold, then back to winter white, as if they were flying through time rather than across geographical space. Margaret, who had now become a teenager, handed Tom a photograph showing the research facility they were supposedly approaching, but in the image he could see his own aircraft parked on the landing strip with a date stamp indicating the photo was taken 30 years in the future. The fuel gauge began moving backward, showing progressively fuller tanks as they continued flying, and Tom's logbook, which he had filled with 15 years of flight records, started, displaying blank pages that gradually filled themselves with entries describing flights he had never taken to destinations that didn't exist. When the landing strip finally appeared ahead of them, Tom could see multiple versions of his own aircraft parked in various states of decay, spanning decades of deterioration, and as he began his approach, Margaret Sinclair, now somehow simultaneously all the ages he had seen her throughout the flight, whispered that the research facility had been studying the effects of temporal displacement on human consciousness, and Tom Bradley had been their most successful test subject, flying the same route endlessly through different decades while believing each iteration was his first and final flight to a place that existed in all times and no time simultaneously. Story number 6. The Mining Camp Incident. Danny Rodriguez and his crew of urban explorers had made a reputation for themselves documenting abandoned industrial sites across Alaska. But the Fairbanks Mining Company's gold extraction facility promised to be their most ambitious exploration yet, having been officially sealed and abandoned in 1974 after a catastrophic collapse that claimed 17 lives. The four-person team, Danny, his girlfriend Jessica Walsh, photographer Marcus Kim, and equipment specialist Lauren Hayes, had obtained permits to document the historical site for a YouTube series about Alaska's forgotten industrial heritage. But when they breached the main entrance tunnel on a frigid February morning, they discovered that the mine was far from abandoned. Fresh tire tracks led directly into the main shaft, industrial lighting hummed with electricity throughout the tunnels, and the sound of heavy machinery echoed from deep within the earth despite the facility having been without power for nearly 5 decades. Danny's team followed the sounds deeper into the mine, their headlamps illuminating support beams and rail tracks that showed recent maintenance, with fresh oil stains and newly replaced hardware that contradicted every historical record they had researched about the site's abandonment. When they reached the main extraction chamber 300 feet below ground, Jessica discovered something that made her scream. A fully operational mining operation complete with modern equipment, fresh safety notices posted on bulletin boards, and time cards showing workers clocking in and out with dates from the current week. The names on the time cards matched exactly with the 17 miners who had died in the 1974 collapse, but the handwriting was fresh, the ink still wet, and the most recent entries showed employees arriving for their shifts just hours before Danny's team had entered the mine. Marcus began photographing the impossible scene when his camera captured something that wasn't visible to the naked eye. Dozens of transparent figures moving throughout the mining equipment, operating machinery and pushing ore carts in a ghostly recreation of their final day of work. But the digital timestamp on his photos showed they were somehow documenting events that had occurred 50 years in the past. The sound of pickaxes striking stone began echoing through the tunnels in a rhythm that matched the historical accounts of the mining operation's daily routine, and Lauren's electronic equipment started detecting electromagnetic signatures consistent with active industrial operations despite no visible source of power in the abandoned facility. When Danny tried to lead his team back to the surface, they discovered that the tunnels had rearranged themselves into a configuration that matched the mine's original 1974 layout, complete with sections that had been permanently sealed after the collapse, and their GPS devices showed they were somehow 3 miles deeper underground than the shaft's documented depth. The workers' voices grew louder and more distinct as Danny's team became lost in the shifting tunnels, and they could hear conversations about safety concerns, rumors of unstable support structures, and plans to finish their shifts early on, what the voices described as the day everything went wrong. Jessica found a miner's break room that contained fresh coffee still steaming in cups, newspapers dated February 18, 1974, the day of the collapse, and a television broadcasting a news report about the mining accident that killed 17 workers, including detailed footage of Danny Rodriguez and his team being rescued from the depths after being trapped for 6 days in sections of the mine that had been sealed for decades. The broadcast continued with interviews of the 4 urban explorers describing their terrifying experience of being trapped with the ghosts of miners who didn't realize they had died 50 years earlier. But as Danny watched himself on the television giving testimony about events that hadn't yet occurred, he realized that the Fairbanks Mining Company disaster was still happening, playing out in an endless loop where the 17 dead miners continued their final shift for eternity, and anyone who entered their domain would become part of the tragedy that had never truly ended. Story number 7. The Northern Lights Witness. Dr. Amanda Foster had dedicated her career to studying the aurora borealis, but the research grant that brought her to an isolated observation station 60 miles north of Barrow would reveal that the northern lights were displaying patterns that violated every known principle of atmospheric physics and suggested something far more terrifying than charged particles dancing in the magnetosphere. Amanda had chosen the location specifically because of its minimal light pollution and optimal magnetic field positioning, but during her 3rd week of observations, she began documenting aurora formations that appeared to respond to her presence, shifting colors and intensities whenever she adjusted her recording equipment or moved between observation points. The lights began forming geometric patterns that resembled complex mathematical equations, and when Amanda photographed these formations, her computer analysis revealed that the aurora was somehow displaying her own unpublished research data across the night sky, including calculations she had completed just hours earlier in the privacy of her isolated station. The phenomena escalated when Amanda discovered that her time-lapse photography was capturing aurora, displays that lasted for hours in her recordings, but her written logs indicated she had only observed the lights for minutes, creating a temporal discrepancy that suggested the northern lights were operating according to a different timeline than the rest of reality. During what should have been a routine observation session, Amanda watched in horror as the aurora began forming recognizable shapes, first abstract geometric forms, then increasingly detailed representations of human figures, and finally perfect silhouettes of herself standing at the observation station, created entirely from dancing green and purple lights hundreds of miles above the Earth's surface. The aurora-formed images of Amanda began moving independently, performing actions she hadn't taken, and when she tried to photograph these impossible displays, her camera captured not only the lights in the sky but also additional versions of herself, standing throughout the tundra around the station, each figure bathed in ethereal aurora light and engaged in different research activities. Amanda's radio equipment began receiving transmissions that seemed to originate from space, but the voices belonged to other researchers describing similar aurora phenomena from observation stations that didn't exist on any scientific registry, and each transmission included detailed discussions of Amanda's current research with insights that advanced her understanding far beyond her current knowledge level. The northern lights began appearing during daylight hours, visible against the bright Arctic sky as impossible cascades of color that responded to Amanda's thoughts rather than solar wind patterns, and her instruments detected electromagnetic signatures suggesting the aurora was somehow scanning her mind and projecting her memories into the upper atmosphere for unknown observers to witness. When Amanda attempted to contact her research supervisors via satellite phone, she discovered that according to university records, she had never been assigned to the observation station. No research grant had been approved for her project, and Dr. Amanda Foster had been reported missing 3 months earlier after failing to return from a routine aurora observation trip near Fairbanks. The aurora displays grew more intense each night, forming increasingly complex scenes that showed Amanda's entire life story played out in ribbons of light across the polar sky, including detailed recreations of conversations and events that no earthly observer could have witnessed, suggesting that something vast and incomprehensible had been studying humanity through the northern lights for far longer than anyone realized. On her final night at the station, Amanda watched as the aurora formed a perfect replica of her observation facility suspended in the sky, complete with a tiny figure of herself standing at the instruments, and she realized that the northern lights weren't a natural phenomenon at all, but rather a cosmic surveillance system that had been documenting human consciousness and experience, with Dr. Amanda Foster serving as the latest subject in an ongoing study conducted by entities that existed far beyond the boundaries of Earth's atmosphere. Entities that had been watching humanity's progress through the beautiful deception of dancing lights that had captivated observers for millennia, while secretly recording every thought, dream, and memory of those who dared to study them too closely.